You're not family, Natasha, you're just the hired help, so why don't you take your discount store dress and sit where you belong? My sister Veronica hissed as she physically grabbed my chair and dragged it away from the main table at her elaborate baby shower. The screech of chair legs against the marble floor of the Goldstone Manor's crystal ballroom echoed through the sudden silence as 30 pairs of eyes turned to witness my public humiliation. My name is Natasha Clearwater, and from wherever you're watching this story unfold, stay with me, because the moment Veronica called me hired help in front of those socialites at Riverside Heights' most exclusive venue, I knew something she didn't. She might have orchestrated this devastating spectacle to cement her position as the family's golden child, but she had no idea that in exactly 3 days, her own senior partner would be addressing me as Your Honor in the very courtroom where her career would either soar or completely shatter. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The afternoon sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Goldstone Manor's grand ballroom, casting everything in that golden hour glow that photographers pay thousands to capture. Veronica had spared absolutely no expense for this baby shower. Cascading arrangements of white peonies and blush roses that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, a champagne wall that sparkled like diamonds, custom French macarons with her unborn son's name Alexander, scripted in edible gold leaf. Everything was picture-perfect, Instagram-ready, designed to showcase the lifestyle she'd cultivated as the rising star at Pemberton Hayes & Associates, one of Riverside Heights' most prestigious law firms. I stood there in my simple charcoal dress, professional, understated, purchased during my lunch break from a department store because I'd rushed directly from a preliminary hearing that morning to make it to her celebration on time. Around me, women draped in designer everything whispered behind their crystal champagne flutes, their gazes following Veronica's pointed gesture toward the corner table she'd designated for me. The table positioned strategically near the service entrance. The table where she'd seated the actual catering staff who were taking their 15-minute breaks. I mean, it's sweet that you want to celebrate with us, Natasha, Veronica continued, her voice carrying that particular tone she'd perfected over the years. Sugar sweet on the surface, but razor sharp underneath, designed to cut deep while maintaining plausible deniability. But this celebration is really for people who understand what it means to build something meaningful, you know? Career women, wives, mothers-to-be, people who've actually accomplished something significant in their lives. The 30-something women surrounding her nodded and murmured their approval. Veronica's carefully curated inner circle of fellow associates from her firm, wives of senior partners, women who'd married exceptionally well and spent their days rotating between Pilates classes, charity luncheons, and spa appointments. They looked at me with that particular brand of pity reserved for the unmarried, the childless, the apparently unsuccessful. If only they knew who was really standing in front of them. I just thought since you're family and all, Veronica continued, placing her perfectly manicured hand protectively over her 6-month bump, that maybe you could help refresh the gift table later, or assist with serving the cake. You're always so good at that sort of thing, so helpful. The word helpful dripped from her lips like honey laced with poison. Helpful. As if my entire existence could be summarized by my willingness to perform menial tasks for her benefit. As if the last 16 years of my life, law school, clerking for a federal appeals judge, working as a prosecutor, my recent appointment to the district court bench, were nothing more than elaborate preparation for my true calling as her personal assistant. Mrs. Pemberton, the wife of Veronica's managing partner, leaned forward with that false sympathy that wealthy women have perfected into an art form. Oh, how wonderful that Veronica has such devoted family support. It really does take a village, doesn't it? Especially when some of us are building real careers. Her eyes swept over me dismissively. What is it you do again, dear? Veronica mentioned you work in some sort of government position? Government position? as if I processed paperwork in some dusty municipal office instead of presiding over criminal and civil cases in a federal courthouse where justice was dispensed daily. But Veronica had always been masterful at diminishing my accomplishments with careful word choices and strategic omissions. To her social circle, I wasn't Judge Natasha Clearwater of the Riverside Heights Federal District Court. I was just Natasha who worked in government and lived alone in a modest townhouse instead of a sprawling estate in the Willow Creek Hills district. Something like that, I replied quietly, my voice steady despite the fury building in my chest like a slow-burning fire. I had learned long ago that correcting Veronica's deliberate misrepresentations in public only led to more elaborate humiliations. Better to let her have her moment of triumph. After all, I'd have mine soon enough. Veronica clapped her hands together, the sound sharp and commanding, like a teacher calling unruly students to attention. Ladies, shall we move on to the gift opening? I'm absolutely dying to see what treasures you've brought for little Alexander. She gestured toward the mountain of perfectly wrapped packages displayed on a table draped in silk that probably cost more than my car payment. Natasha, darling, she added, turning to me with that same false sweetness, would you mind moving those chairs out of the way? The photographer needs a clear shot for the gift opening ceremony. And there it was, the moment that crystallized everything wrong with our relationship. Everything toxic about the dynamic we'd fallen into over the years. In front of 30 witnesses, she'd reduced me to furniture-moving help at her celebration. Not a sister, not family, just useful labor disguised as familial obligation. But what Veronica didn't know, what none of them knew, was that in exactly 3 days she would be walking into my courtroom as opposing counsel on the biggest case of her career. The same woman who'd just called me hired help would be forced to address me as Your Honor, while arguing before the bench I'd worked 16 years to earn. Sometimes the universe has a perfect sense of timing, and sometimes justice comes dressed as the sweetest possible irony. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. What the 30 women in that crystal ballroom didn't know, what Veronica had never bothered to learn about her own sister, was that the government worker standing quietly by the service table was actually Judge Natasha Clearwater, the youngest federal judge ever appointed to the Riverside Heights District Court bench. At 35, I held one of the most powerful positions in the regional justice system, and I had earned every single moment of the respect that came with it. Hey everyone, before we dive deeper into this story, I'm curious, where are you watching from today? Drop your city or country in the comments because this tale of family dynamics and unexpected power reversals seems to resonate with people everywhere. And if you're enjoying this journey of justice, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow I have something absolutely incredible lined up for you. A story that will make today's events look like just the beginning. The irony of Veronica's dismissal was so profound it was almost artistic. While she painted me as some low-level bureaucrat shuffling papers in a forgotten corner of City Hall, the reality was that I wielded more actual authority than anyone else in that room. Federal judges don't just work in government. We are the government's judicial branch. We interpret constitutional law, set legal precedents that affect millions of people, and make decisions that reshape entire industries. My corner office at the Edmund Fitzgerald Federal Courthouse commanded a panoramic view of downtown Riverside Heights, with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city where laws were made and justice was served. My chambers were appointed with rich mahogany furniture, first-edition legal texts, and constitutional documents, a workspace that reflected the gravity and dignity of federal jurisprudence. Every morning, I walked through corridors lined with portraits of legendary judges who had shaped American law, knowing that my own decisions would join that historical continuum. The gavel that sat on my bench wasn't just a ceremonial tool. It was an instrument of power that could send corporate executives to prison, protect civil rights, and determine the fate of cases involving millions of dollars. When I entered my courtroom, everyone rose. When I spoke, attorneys with decades of experience listened with absolute attention. When I made a ruling, it became legal precedent that other courts would follow for years to come. But in Veronica's carefully constructed narrative, I was just poor Natasha who worked in government and couldn't afford the designer lifestyle that marked true success in her social circle. She'd spent years crafting this image of me as the lesser sister, the one who'd settled for noble but unrewarding public service, while she climbed the ladder at a prestigious private firm. The contrast between perception and reality was staggering. While Veronica impressed clients with her corner office at Pemberton Hayes & Associates, I presided over a courtroom where life-changing decisions were made daily. While she attended networking events and charity galas to build her professional image, I was building legal precedents that would be studied in law schools and cited in courts across the country. While she measured success in billable hours and partnership prospects, I measured impact in lives protected, rights defended, and justice served. My salary as a federal judge was public record significantly more than what senior associates at even prestigious firms like Pemberton Hayes earned, with benefits and security that private practice could never match. My pension was guaranteed by the federal government, my health care was comprehensive, and my job security was protected by constitutional provisions that made federal judges essentially unsinkable once appointed. I had achieved what lawyers call the golden ticket, lifetime tenure with the full authority of the federal judiciary behind every decision I made. More importantly, my appointment had come with recognition that Veronica's private practice success could never match. The President of the United States had nominated me personally, based on recommendations from the Federal Judicial Selection Committee. The Senate had confirmed my appointment unanimously after reviewing my record of legal excellence. Chief Justice Hamilton had administered my oath of office in a ceremony attended by governors, senators, and legal luminaries from across the region. The day I was sworn in, major newspapers had covered the story with headlines like, "Youngest federal judge in regional history takes bench," and "Rising legal star brings fresh perspective to federal court." Legal journals had profiled my background and predicted that my appointment signaled a new direction in federal jurisprudence. Bar associations had issued statements praising my qualifications and expressing confidence in my ability to serve justice with distinction. But Veronica had missed all of that recognition. She'd been too busy with a client retreat in the Hamptons during my swearing-in ceremony, too occupied with her own career milestones to pay attention to her sister's historic achievement. When family members had mentioned my appointment, she'd smiled and changed the subject to her latest case victory or partnership track progress. This pattern of selective attention had defined our relationship for years. Veronica had perfected the art of diminishing my accomplishments while amplifying her own, creating a family narrative where she was the successful one, and I was the well-meaning but unremarkable sister who'd chosen a path of limited financial rewards and social recognition. Standing in that ballroom, watching her accept congratulations for her pregnancy and recent promotion to senior associate, I thought about all the time she'd managed to overshadow my genuine achievements with her own carefully timed announcements and manufactured crises. Every milestone in my legal career had been upstaged by some dramatic development in her life that required immediate family attention and celebration. The woman who just publicly humiliated me had no idea that 3 blocks away, my nameplate read, "The Honorable Natasha Clearwater," on an office door that opened onto one of the most powerful positions in the American legal system. She didn't know that attorneys across 3 states knew my name and respected my judicial philosophy. She couldn't imagine that law clerks competed fiercely for the privilege of working in my chambers, or that my legal opinions were already being cited by appellate courts as models of clear reasoning and constitutional interpretation. In 3 days, when she walked into federal court for the biggest case of her career, she would discover that the sister she'd just called hired help controlled every aspect of that courtroom. She would learn that the government worker she'd dismissed as irrelevant had the power to make or break the legal arguments that would determine her future at Pemberton Hayes. But for now, she basked in her moment of social superiority, surrounded by women who had no idea they were witnessing the public humiliation of one of the most powerful people in Riverside Heights' legal community. The tables were about to turn in ways that Veronica couldn't possibly imagine. The gift opening ceremony began with all the fanfare of a royal presentation. Veronica had positioned herself in an ornate velvet armchair at the center of the room, her silk maternity dress arranged perfectly to catch the afternoon light streaming through the crystal chandeliers. A professional photographer circled around her like a shark, capturing every moment for what I assumed would become Veronica's latest social media campaign, showcasing her perfect life as a successful attorney expecting her first child. I stood quietly by my assigned corner table, moving chairs and straightening place settings as requested, but my mind was elsewhere entirely. While my hands performed these menial tasks, my thoughts were focused on the case file sitting on my desk back at the courthouse. Richardson Industries versus Environmental Protection Coalition, scheduled for preliminary hearings this coming Monday morning at 9 a.m. sharp. "Ladies, please gather around," Mrs. Pemberton announced, her diamond-encrusted hands catching the light as she gestured toward Veronica's makeshift throne. "Our beautiful mother-to-be is ready to see what treasures we've brought for little Alexander." The 30 women formed a perfect semicircle around Veronica, their faces bright with the kind of anticipation that comes from knowing you're about to witness someone else's moment of supreme happiness. The energy in the room was electric, charged with female camaraderie and shared excitement about new life and new beginnings. Veronica reached for the first gift, a massive box wrapped in hand-painted Italian paper that probably cost more than most people's weekly grocery budget. Inside was a custom-designed nursery mobile, featuring hand-blown glass animals in shades of blue and silver, each piece individually crafted by artisans in Venice. The women cooed and gasped appropriately as Veronica held up each delicate figure to catch the light. "Oh, Jennifer, this is absolutely divine!" Veronica gushed, her voice carrying that perfect blend of gratitude and social performance. "Alexander's nursery is going to be like a magical wonderland, and this will be the perfect centerpiece above his hand-carved mahogany crib." More gifts followed in rapid succession, each one more extravagant than the last. A cashmere baby blanket that cost $1,200. A designer diaper bag that looked more like a luxury handbag than anything practical for childcare. A silver rattle engraved with Alexander's full name and expected birth date, even though he hadn't arrived yet. Each present was accompanied by squeals of delight and social media-worthy expressions of gratitude. But while I watched this display of conspicuous consumption, my mind kept returning to the Richardson case. The preliminary briefs had been submitted last Friday, and I'd spent the weekend reviewing the complex environmental law issues at stake. Richardson Industries, one of the largest manufacturing companies in the tri-state area, was being sued by a coalition of environmental groups for allegedly dumping toxic chemicals into the Clearwater River system, the same river system that provided drinking water to over 2 million residents. The case was massive, involving potential damages in the hundreds of millions of dollars and environmental remediation that could take decades to complete. More importantly, it was the kind of case that could establish precedents for environmental protection law that would influence federal policy for generations. The preliminary hearings would determine whether the case moved forward to full trial or was dismissed on technical grounds. What made the case personally interesting was that Pemberton Hayes and Associates was representing Richardson Industries, and according to the court filings, Veronica was listed as the lead associate on their legal team. She'd apparently been working on this case for 8 months, building what the legal community was calling one of the most sophisticated corporate defense strategies in recent memory. "Oh my goodness!" Veronica squealed as she unwrapped what appeared to be a baby carrier made from organic silk and hand-stitched with gold thread. "This is from that boutique in Paris where European royalty shops." How did you even know about this place? The gift giver, a woman I recognized as the wife of Pemberton Hayes' senior environmental law partner, preened with satisfaction. I have connections in the luxury baby goods world, only the finest for our rising star's little prince. That comment made me pause in my chair arranging duties. Rising star. The phrase carried weight in legal circles, suggesting that Veronica's work on the Richardson case was being viewed as a potential career-defining achievement. If she successfully defended Richardson Industries against the Environmental Coalition, it would cement her reputation as a formidable corporate attorney and virtually guarantee her partnership at Pemberton Hayes. "Natasha, darling?" Veronica's voice cut through my thoughts like a blade. "Could you be a dear and collect all this wrapping paper? We don't want the photographer's shots to look cluttered." I bent down to gather the discarded gift wrap, my face carefully neutral despite the surge of anticipation building in my chest. As I collected sheets of expensive paper and silk ribbons, I thought about Monday morning's hearing. Veronica had no idea that her biggest professional moment would be playing out in front of the sister she'd just humiliated. She didn't know that the judge who would determine whether her carefully constructed legal arguments had merit was the same person she'd just asked to clean up trash. The irony was so perfect it felt orchestrated by the universe itself. For months, Veronica had been preparing for what she believed would be her triumphant moment, walking into federal court to defend a major corporation against environmental charges, demonstrating her legal brilliance in front of senior partners who would decide her partnership fate. She'd probably envisioned impressing some random federal judge with her meticulous preparation and sophisticated arguments. Instead, she would find herself standing before the sister whose career she'd spent years dismissing as unremarkable government work. The sister she'd just publicly humiliated would be wearing the black robe that represented the ultimate authority in that courtroom. Every argument she made, every objection she raised, every procedural motion she filed would be subject to my approval or denial. "This next gift is from someone very special," Mrs. Pemberton announced, pulling my attention back to the ceremony. "This is from Veronica's dear sister Natasha, who wanted to contribute something meaningful to Alexander's future." Veronica picked up my modest package with the same enthusiasm she'd shown for the luxury items, though I could see the slight tightening around her eyes that suggested she was preparing for something embarrassing. The other women leaned forward with polite interest, probably expecting to see something touching but financially modest that would further confirm my position as the family's less successful member. She tore through the simple cream-colored wrapping to reveal a leather-bound first edition of Goodnight Moon from 1947, signed by author Margaret Wise Brown. The room fell completely silent. This wasn't some discount store purchase or generic gift card. This was a genuine literary treasure, the kind of thing that belonged in rare book collections or museum displays. The book had cost me 4 months of discretionary income when I'd found it at a prestigious auction house 2 years ago, but I'd bought it anyway because I'd always planned to give it to Veronica's first child. The inscription I'd written in careful calligraphy read, "For Alexander, may you always find wonder in stories and strength in knowledge. With love, Aunt Natasha." "Oh," Veronica said, her voice smaller than it had been all afternoon. She opened the cover and saw the inscription, and for just a moment I thought I saw something genuine flash across her face. Surprise, maybe even gratitude. But then Mrs. Pemberton leaned over to examine the book more closely, and I watched Veronica's expression shift back into social performance mode. "How thoughtful," she said, though her tone suggested she was still processing the unexpected value of my gift. "A first edition Margaret Wise Brown," Mrs. Pemberton murmured, clearly recognizing the significance. "These are quite rare, aren't they?" The moment hung in the air like a question mark. For 30 seconds, the power dynamic in the room had shifted slightly. The poor relation had just presented a gift that outclassed most of the luxury items in terms of lasting value and thoughtfulness. But Veronica recovered quickly, setting the book aside and reaching for the next elaborately wrapped package. "Well," she said with a bright smile, "let's see what other treasures await little Alexander." As the gift opening continued, I quietly finished collecting the wrapping paper and returned to my corner table. But something had changed in those 30 seconds when the rare book had commanded unexpected respect. Several women were glancing at me with curiosity rather than pity, probably wondering how a government worker had acquired such an expensive and meaningful gift. I smiled to myself as I folded the discarded wrapping paper. If they were puzzled by a rare book, they were going to be absolutely shocked when they learned what other surprises the Quiet Sister had in store. Monday morning was going to be very educational for everyone involved. The humiliation at the baby shower wasn't an isolated incident. It was simply the latest entry in a decades-long pattern that had started when we were children and had only grown more sophisticated and cruel over the years. Veronica had always possessed an almost supernatural ability to diminish my achievements while elevating her own, and our parents had not only enabled this dynamic, but had actively participated in it every step of the way. I remember the exact moment I first understood how this system worked. I was 11, Veronica was 9, and I had just won the Riverside Heights Elementary Science Fair, with a project on renewable energy that I'd spent 4 months perfecting. I'd built a working wind turbine from scratch, documented how different blade angles affected power generation, and created a presentation that impressed the judges so much they recommended me for the regional competition. The local newspaper had even planned to feature me in their Young Innovators section the following week. But on the morning my interview was scheduled to run, Veronica came downstairs in tears because she'd forgotten to study for her spelling test and was facing her first ever failing grade. Our mother, Patricia, immediately shifted into crisis management mode, canceling her morning appointments to drive to school for an emergency conference with Veronica's teacher. Our father, David, rearranged his entire day to help Veronica create flashcards and practice words, turning our dining room into an intensive tutoring center. My newspaper interview was postponed indefinitely, while the family mobilized around Veronica's spelling emergency. The science fair trophy ended up on a shelf in the basement storage room, while Veronica's makeup spelling test, a mediocre performance on words like because and beautiful, earned a place of honor on the refrigerator with a gold star sticker and a note from Mom praising her determination to overcome challenges. The message was unmistakable. Veronica's problems, no matter how manufactured or avoidable, would always take precedence over my achievements, no matter how significant or hard-earned. This pattern repeated with devastating consistency throughout our teenage years. When I was elected student body president during my junior year, a position I'd campaigned for with detailed policy proposals and innovative fundraising ideas, Veronica suddenly developed severe anxiety about her SAT scores and needed intensive support and tutoring that somehow required the entire family's attention and financial resources. My victory celebration was cut short to focus on Veronica's test prep, and my presidential responsibilities became background noise to her standardized testing drama. When I graduated as valedictorian with a full scholarship to Northwestern University, Veronica was simultaneously struggling with her college application essays and needed help crafting personal statements that our parents ended up practically writing for her. The weekend of my graduation ceremony was dominated by Veronica's college stress, and my valedictorian speech was hurriedly attended between frantic editing sessions of her university applications. But the most devastating example of this pattern occurred during my senior year of college when I received early acceptance to Harvard Law School, a dream I'd worked toward since middle school, with perfect grades, stellar LSAT scores, and internships at prestigious legal organizations. The acceptance letter arrived on a Tuesday in March, and I was practically vibrating with excitement as I waited for our parents to come home from work so I could share the incredible news. But Veronica, who was finishing her sophomore year at a state university, had called our parents in tears that same afternoon, claiming she'd been brutally rejected from her top-choice transfer school. By the time Mom and Dad walked through the front door, Veronica was curled up on the couch with tissues and hot chocolate, playing the role of devastated student to perfection. "This is the worst day of my life," she sobbed, as our parents rushed to comfort her. "Everyone's going to think I'm a failure. I'll never get into a good program now. My entire future is ruined." I stood in the kitchen doorway, Harvard acceptance letter still clutched in my hand, watching my parents console Veronica over what turned out to be a waitlist notification, not even an actual rejection. When I finally managed to share my news, their responses were distracted and perfunctory. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," Dad said, barely looking up from rubbing Veronica's back. "We'll celebrate later. Your sister needs us right now." "Congratulations, honey," Mom added absently. "Maybe you can help Veronica research some backup transfer options while you're home for spring break." We never did celebrate. Veronica's transfer drama consumed the next 3 weeks, during which she received acceptances to 4 excellent schools, including 2 that were better than her original "top choice." But by then my Harvard news felt stale, old, already overshadowed by Veronica's latest triumph, and the family's collective relief that her educational crisis had resolved successfully. This dynamic followed us into adulthood with surgical precision. When I passed the bar exam on my first attempt with scores high enough to qualify for federal clerkship positions, Veronica was simultaneously planning her engagement to Bradley Morrison, an investment banker she'd been dating for 6 months. The announcement of her engagement party required immediate family assistance, with venue research, invitation design, and catering decisions that somehow took priority over celebrating my professional milestone. When I secured my prestigious federal clerkship with Judge Patricia Hendricks on the 7th Circuit Court of Appeals, a position that typically launched careers toward the Supreme Court, Veronica was house hunting with Bradley and needed family help reviewing mortgage applications and attending property inspections. My clerkship orientation was scheduled the same weekend as her final house showing, and the family chose real estate over my judicial career launch. The most crushing example had occurred just 2 years ago when I received my federal judicial nomination. The call came from the White House Personnel Office on a Thursday morning, informing me that the president had selected me from among hundreds of qualified candidates for the federal bench. It was the culmination of everything I'd worked toward, recognition not just of my legal expertise, but of my character, judgment, and potential to serve justice for decades to come. I called our parents immediately, my voice shaking with excitement as I explained what this meant, that their daughter was about to join the ranks of federal judges who shaped American law, that I would have lifetime tenure on the federal bench, that legal historians would study my decisions for generations. "That's incredible, darling," Mom had said, and I could hear genuine pride in her voice. "We're so proud of you. This is exactly what you've worked so hard to achieve." But before I could share any details about the confirmation process or the swearing-in ceremony, her tone shifted. "Listen, I hate to cut this short, but I need to call you back. Veronica just found out she's having some complications with her pregnancy, and Bradley's traveling for work. She needs me to drive her to the doctor right away." The pregnancy complications turned out to be morning sickness. Completely normal, manageable morning sickness that Veronica had apparently dramatized into a medical emergency, requiring our mother's immediate presence. By the time I finally got to share the full significance of my judicial nomination, the moment had passed. Veronica's pregnancy became the family's primary focus, and my historic appointment became a footnote in family conversation. Dad's reaction was even more telling. When I called to tell him his daughter was about to become a federal judge, he listened politely and offered congratulations, but then immediately shifted the conversation to Veronica's nursery planning and his excitement about becoming a grandfather. My lifetime appointment to the federal judiciary was treated as nice news, while Veronica's routine pregnancy was treated as a family miracle, requiring constant attention and celebration. This pattern had shaped our entire family dynamic for 25 years. Veronica had learned exactly when to create crises that would overshadow my successes, how to time her emotional needs for maximum impact, which triggers would redirect our parents' attention most effectively. She'd perfected the art of making her problems seem more urgent than my achievements, her struggles more worthy of family support than my triumphs. Our parents, meanwhile, had developed an unconscious but consistent bias toward crisis management over celebration. They were always more motivated to solve Veronica's problems than to acknowledge my successes, more energized by her dramatic needs than inspired by my quiet accomplishments. They'd trained themselves to see Veronica's tears as more important than my trophies, her stress as more significant than my scholarships. And now, at 35, I was watching this same dynamic play out at Veronica's baby shower. Once again, her moment was center stage while I was relegated to the sidelines. Once again, her happiness was the family priority while my dignity was expendable. Once again, she was the star while I was reduced to supporting cast. But this time, Veronica had made a critical miscalculation. This time, her moment of triumph was about to collide with consequences she couldn't manipulate, control, or overshadow. In 3 days, all those years of careful family positioning would become completely irrelevant in the face of actual institutional power. What Veronica never bothered to ask about, what she'd never shown the slightest curiosity toward, was the grueling 16-year journey that had brought me from that basement science fair trophy to the federal courthouse, where I now presided over cases that shaped national policy. While she saw someone who worked in government, the reality was a path paved with sacrifice, determination, and choices that prioritized justice over comfort at every critical juncture. The road to that black robe hadn't been lined with the privileges that had smoothed Veronica's ascent through the legal world. While she'd sailed through Northwestern Law School on our parents' generous financial support, living in a luxury downtown apartment and networking at exclusive social events, I'd worked 3 jobs to pay my way through the University of Chicago Law School. Mornings at a campus coffee shop, serving overpriced lattes to undergraduates, afternoons tutoring struggling students in constitutional law, and nights cleaning office buildings in Chicago's financial district, all while maintaining a 3.8 GPA and serving as executive editor of the Law Review. My law school years were defined by 18-hour days and a diet consisting primarily of instant ramen and whatever leftover pastries I could salvage from the coffee shop. While Veronica attended wine tastings and charity auctions that built her professional network, I spent weekends in the university library, reading Supreme Court decisions by the hundreds, and writing law review articles that would eventually catch the attention of federal judges looking for exceptional clerks. After graduation, while Veronica landed her dream associate position at Pemberton Hayes through our father's golf buddy connections, I started at the absolute bottom as a public defender in Chicago's Cook County system, making $38,000 a year. For 4 years, I represented clients who couldn't afford private attorneys, working 20-hour days in a windowless basement office with computers that crashed daily and a coffee machine that hadn't functioned properly since the Clinton administration. Those years defending the indigent taught me something Veronica would never learn in her gleaming corner office: what justice really meant when you stripped away the billable hours and partnership politics. I fought for teenage mothers facing drug charges that could separate them from their children forever. I defended elderly men who'd been cheated out of their life savings by white-collar criminals. I represented immigrants navigating a legal system designed to exclude them, working with translators to ensure they understood their rights and options. Every case was a lesson in how the law could protect the vulnerable or crush them, depending on the skill and dedication of their advocate. I learned to research obscure precedents that could save a client from deportation, to craft arguments that could reduce a sentence from years to months, to find constitutional violations that could overturn wrongful convictions. The work was emotionally devastating and financially unrewarding, but it was necessary in ways that corporate law never could be. When the federal prosecutor's office offered me a position 5 years later, I jumped at the chance to fight from the other side of the courtroom. As an assistant United States attorney, I spent another 6 years putting away predators who exploited children, white-collar criminals who stole pension funds, corrupt officials who sold their offices to the highest bidder. The cases were complex, high stakes, and often required years of investigation before reaching trial. I remember working until 3 in the morning preparing for a human trafficking case, reviewing evidence that made me physically sick, but that was essential to securing convictions against monsters who treated vulnerable people as commodities. I recall spending entire weekends at the office building racketeering cases against organized crime figures who'd corrupted entire municipal governments. While Veronica attended weekend spa retreats in wine country, I was studying financial records that revealed how supposedly legitimate businesses were actually fronts for money laundering operations. The work required not just legal expertise but psychological resilience that tested every boundary I'd thought I had. I comforted families of murder victims during trials where defense attorneys tried to blame the deceased for their own deaths. I explained complex financial crimes to juries who needed to understand how pension fraud had destroyed retirement security for thousands of workers. I faced death threats from gang members whose operations I'd helped dismantle, requiring federal marshals to escort me to and from the courthouse for months at a time. But each successful prosecution built my reputation within the federal legal community as someone who combined meticulous preparation with unwavering ethical standards. My conviction rate was among the highest in the district, but more importantly, my cases were reviewed and upheld on appeal consistently because I built them on solid legal foundations rather than prosecutorial tricks or constitutional shortcuts. The judicial appointment had come after Judge Morrison's unexpected early retirement created an opening on the federal bench. The position required nomination by the President and confirmation by the Senate, a process that involved months of background investigation, interviews with legal organizations, and public hearings where my qualifications were scrutinized by senators from both parties. The American Bar Association had rated me exceptionally well qualified, their highest rating, based on interviews with hundreds of attorneys who'd worked with me over the years. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had conducted a background check so thorough they'd interviewed my elementary school teachers and college roommates. Civil rights organizations had endorsed my nomination based on my record of protecting vulnerable populations. Victims' rights groups had supported my confirmation because of my sensitivity to their needs during prosecution. The Senate Judiciary Committee hearings had lasted 3 days, with senators grilling me on everything from constitutional interpretation to case management philosophy. I'd answered questions about specific decisions I'd made as a prosecutor, legal theories I'd developed in law review articles, and how I would handle the ethical responsibilities of lifetime tenure on the federal bench. Senator Catherine Walsh had asked me directly, "Judge Clearwater, what drives your commitment to justice? What makes you believe you can serve the American people fairly and impartially from the federal bench?" My answer had been honest and unrehearsed. "Senator, I've spent 15 years seeing how the law affects real people's lives. I've seen how justice can protect the innocent and punish the guilty, but I've also seen how injustice can destroy families and communities. Federal judges have enormous power to shape how laws are interpreted and applied. I believe that power should be used to ensure equal justice under law, regardless of wealth, status, or political connections." The confirmation vote had been unanimous, 96-0, with 4 senators absent. Chief Justice Hamilton had administered my oath of office in a ceremony attended by governors, senators, and legal scholars from across the country. The oath itself was simple but profound. "I do solemnly swear that I will administer justice without respect to persons, and do equal right to the poor and to the rich, and that I will faithfully and impartially discharge and perform all the duties incumbent upon me as a federal judge under the Constitution and laws of the United States. So help me God." Veronica had been invited to the swearing-in ceremony, of course. She'd claimed scheduling conflicts with a client event, but her Instagram stories that day showed her at a luxury spa resort getting couples massages with Bradley. No congratulations text, no acknowledgement that her sister had just achieved one of the highest honors in the American legal system. Just radio silence that spoke volumes about what she truly thought of my career trajectory. In the 18 months since taking the bench, I'd presided over cases that had shaped federal policy and legal precedent across multiple states. My decision in United States versus Meridian Financial had established new standards for prosecuting cryptocurrency fraud. My ruling in Coalition for Clean Air versus Riverside Manufacturing had strengthened environmental protection enforcement. My opinion in Chen versus Immigration Services had protected asylum seekers from deportation to countries where they faced persecution. Law schools were already teaching my decisions as examples of clear constitutional reasoning. Federal courts and other circuits were citing my opinions as persuasive authority in similar cases. Legal journals had published articles analyzing my judicial philosophy and predicting its long-term influence on federal jurisprudence. But none of that institutional recognition mattered to Veronica. In her world, success was measured in designer handbags, luxury cars, and social media followers. My federal salary, while respectable, couldn't buy the lifestyle she valued. My modest townhouse in the historic district couldn't compete with her mansion in Willow Creek Hills. Most importantly, my work didn't generate the kind of glamorous stories that played well at cocktail parties. So I'd become invisible at family gatherings. The sister who worked in government, the unmarried one without children, the serious one who left parties early because she had court in the morning. Veronica had carefully cultivated this image of me as the lesser sibling, the one who'd settled for noble but unrewarding public service, while she built a lucrative private practice. On Monday morning, she would discover exactly how much power her government worker sister had accumulated during those 16 years of sacrifice and service. The baby shower humiliation struck particularly deep because it came at the end of the most professionally challenging 18 months of my life, a period when I desperately needed family support, but had instead found Veronica using my struggles as opportunities to showcase her own supposed superiority. During my first year on the federal bench, when the isolation and pressure of judicial service had tested every boundary of my emotional resilience, she'd been too absorbed in building her own career narrative to notice that her sister was drowning. Federal judges operate under ethical constraints that effectively eliminate most normal social relationships. I couldn't accept dinner invitations from attorneys who might appear before my court. I couldn't attend political fundraisers or advocate for causes, no matter how personally meaningful. I couldn't discuss pending cases with friends or family, which meant that the most significant part of my daily life became off-limits for normal conversation. The loneliness had been suffocating. After years of building friendships within the legal community as a prosecutor, I suddenly found myself professionally isolated. Former colleagues became respectful but distant. You don't casually grab drinks with a sitting federal judge. Old friends grew uncomfortable around me, unsure how to navigate conversations when so many topics were now professionally inappropriate for me to discuss. The social connections that had sustained me through the grinding years of public service evaporated almost overnight. I'd reached out to Veronica repeatedly during those first difficult months, hoping that family bonds might provide the emotional anchor I desperately needed. The cases I was handling involved life-altering decisions that kept me awake at night. Drug sentencing that would separate fathers from their children for decades. Corporate fraud cases where elderly victims had lost their life savings. Immigration decisions that could literally determine whether families lived or died. During one particularly brutal week in November, I'd presided over a human trafficking case that involved children younger than my nephews would be. The evidence was so disturbing that 2 jurors had to be excused due to emotional distress. The defendant's attorney had argued that his client was a minor player in a larger criminal organization, deserving of mercy despite the horrific crimes. The prosecution had presented evidence showing systematic abuse of victims as young as 12 years old. I'd called Veronica that evening, my hands literally shaking from the emotional weight of what I'd witnessed. "I don't know how to process this," I'd confided, my voice barely above a whisper. "Today I listened to testimony about children being sold like merchandise. The defense wants me to show leniency to someone who facilitated the rape of kids. But if I'm too harsh, I could create grounds for appeal that might overturn the conviction entirely." There had been a pause on the line, And for a moment, I thought she was absorbing the gravity of what I'd shared. Then she'd sighed dramatically. "That does sound awful, Natasha," she'd said in the tone she typically reserved for discussing minor inconveniences like traffic delays. "But honestly, didn't you know that federal judges deal with terrible cases? I mean, that's literally what the job involves." The casual dismissal had felt like a physical blow. As if my anguish over child trafficking was just an occupational hazard I should have anticipated and accepted without complaint. As if the sleepless nights and emotional trauma were simply part of a career choice I'd made thoughtlessly. "Anyway," Veronica had continued without missing a beat, "I actually called to ask you something. Bradley and I are thinking about hiring an interior designer for the nursery, and I remembered you mentioning something about that decorator who did your townhouse. Do you still have her contact information? We want someone who understands sophisticated aesthetics but can work within our budget parameters." She'd managed to minimize my crisis while simultaneously asking me to help solve her completely manufactured design dilemma. The irony was staggering. While I was dealing with actual human trafficking, she was worried about nursery aesthetics. While I was struggling with decisions that affected children's lives, she was focused on decorating for her unborn child. This pattern had repeated with devastating consistency throughout my first year on the bench. When I'd struggled with a complex civil rights case involving police misconduct, Veronica had been too busy with a weekend getaway in the Hamptons to take my call. When I'd agonized over a sentencing decision that would determine whether a young father spent 5 years or 15 years in prison for drug trafficking, Veronica had been occupied with planning her maternity photo shoot with a celebrity photographer. The worst incident had occurred just 4 months ago during the Richardson Industries preliminary case preparation. Richardson Industries was facing federal environmental charges for allegedly dumping toxic chemicals into the Clearwater River system, the same river that provided drinking water to 2 million residents across 3 counties. The case involved potential damages in the hundreds of millions and environmental remediation that could take decades. What made the case personally complex was the mounting evidence that Richardson had known about the contamination for years, but had deliberately concealed it from federal regulators. Internal company documents revealed executives joking about keeping the tree huggers in the dark, while continuing to dump chemicals they knew were causing cancer clusters in downstream communities. I'd spent weeks reviewing scientific studies about the health impacts, reading medical testimony about children developing leukemia at rates 3 times the national average, studying environmental reports that showed decades of systematic poisoning of the water supply. The evidence was so overwhelming and horrifying that I'd had trouble sleeping, knowing that corporate executives had literally traded children's lives for quarterly profit margins. I'd called Veronica on the night before the preliminary hearing, desperately needing someone to help me process the moral weight of what I was seeing. "Veronica, I need to talk to someone about something that's been eating at me," I'd begun, my voice strained with exhaustion and stress. "The case I'm hearing tomorrow involves a company that's been poisoning drinking water for 15 years. They knew children were getting sick from their chemicals, and they covered it up to protect their stock price. I'm looking at evidence that shows toddlers developing brain tumors, because executives decided that environmental compliance was too expensive." I'd paused, waiting for some acknowledgement of the gravity of what I was describing. Instead, Veronica had responded with obvious distraction. That's terrible," she'd murmured absently. "Listen, can I call you back? Bradley and I are reviewing paint samples for the master bedroom renovation, and the contractor is only available for consultation tonight. We're trying to choose between smoky quartz and dove gray, and honestly, they look identical to me." The disconnect was so profound it felt surreal. While I was struggling with evidence of systematic child poisoning, she was agonizing over paint colors. While I was preparing to make decisions that could determine whether families received justice for their poisoned children, she was focused on bedroom aesthetics. "Veronica," I'd said, trying to keep the desperation out of my voice, "I really need to talk about this. These cases are affecting me in ways I didn't expect. The isolation of this job is harder than I thought it would be." "I'm sure it's stressful," she'd replied, her attention clearly elsewhere. "But you chose this career, didn't you?" Federal judges get paid well precisely because they handle difficult cases. Maybe you should talk to a therapist if it's affecting you this much. She'd hung up to focus on paint samples while I sat alone in my chambers, surrounded by evidence of corporate malfeasance that had destroyed hundreds of families. That night, I'd realized that my sister saw my judicial responsibilities as nothing more than a well-compensated job, no different from any other career that involved occasional stress. What she didn't understand, what she'd never bothered to learn, was that federal judges don't just handle cases, we carry the weight of justice itself. Every decision we make shapes how laws are interpreted for generations. Every ruling affects not just the parties before us, but thousands of future litigants who will be governed by the precedents we establish. The Richardson Industries case had become even more personal when I discovered that Pemberton Hayes was representing the defendants, with Veronica listed as the lead associate on their defense team. The sister who'd dismissed my concerns about corporate poisoning was actively working to protect the company responsible for it. Over the past 4 months, while I'd been losing sleep over evidence of systematic environmental crimes, Veronica had been crafting legal arguments to help Richardson escape accountability. While I'd been studying medical reports about children developing cancer from contaminated water, she'd been developing strategies to dismiss those same health impacts as unrelated to her client's actions. Now, standing in that crystal ballroom watching her accept congratulations for her pregnancy and career success, I couldn't help but think about the children in those medical reports. Kids who would never have the chance to grow up healthy because a corporation had decided their lives were worth less than quarterly profits. In 72 hours, Veronica would discover that the sister she'd been too busy to support during the most challenging period of her career would be the one determining whether her legal arguments had merit. The judge she would need to impress with her environmental law expertise was the same person she'd dismissed as overwrought when I'd tried to share the emotional weight of handling environmental crimes. Justice, it seemed, had been preparing this moment for months. Sunday evening found me in my home office with the Richardson Industries case file spread across my mahogany desk like a roadmap to corporate corruption. What I discovered in those hundreds of pages of legal documents, scientific reports, and internal communications wasn't just a routine environmental lawsuit. It was a systematic pattern of deliberate poisoning that made Veronica's involvement feel like a personal betrayal of everything our family had supposedly taught us about right and wrong. The case file told a story that began 3 years ago when Richardson Industries, a chemical manufacturing giant headquartered in Riverside Heights, had quietly begun dumping industrial waste into the Clearwater River system through a network of underground pipes designed to avoid detection by environmental regulators. The Clearwater River provided drinking water to over 2 million residents across Riverside Heights, Millbrook County, and the suburban communities that stretched along its banks for nearly 100 miles. According to the Environmental Protection Coalition's meticulously documented complaint, Richardson hadn't simply made a few isolated mistakes or cut corners to save money. They'd implemented a comprehensive strategy to avoid environmental compliance while maintaining the appearance of corporate responsibility. Internal company emails revealed executives referring to environmental regulations as profit reducers and EPA inspectors as revenue terrorists who needed to be managed rather than accommodated. The health consequences had been catastrophic and undeniable. Medical records from hospitals along the river showed cancer rates that were 3 times the national average in children under 10 years old. Birth defect rates had increased by 400% over the past 30 months. Emergency room admissions for respiratory distress in elderly patients had doubled. Pediatric oncology wards that had typically seen 2 or 3 new cases per year were now treating dozens of children with rare blood cancers and brain tumors. Dr. Patricia Hennings, the county's chief epidemiologist, had produced statistical analysis showing clear correlation between proximity to Richardson's dumping sites and the severity of health impacts. Children living within 5 miles of the primary contamination source were developing leukemia at rates that defied any explanation other than systematic chemical exposure. Pregnant women in affected areas were experiencing miscarriage rates that had prompted the state health department to issue emergency advisories about water consumption. But the most damaging evidence came from Richardson Industries' own internal documents, obtained through whistleblower testimony from former employees who could no longer live with what they'd witnessed. Email chains between company executives revealed not just knowledge of the contamination, but active discussion of strategies to conceal it from federal regulators and affected communities. One particularly damning communication thread involved Richardson's CEO, Marcus Thornfield, and their head of environmental compliance, discussing how to handle increasing reports of childhood cancer clusters. Rather than investigating potential connections to their dumping operations, they'd hired a public relations firm to develop messaging that would cast doubt on any link between their activities and community health problems. The key is to make this look like natural statistical variation, Thornfield had written in an email dated 18 months ago. We need to plant questions about other potential causes: air pollution from traffic, naturally occurring chemicals in soil, lifestyle factors that might explain the health patterns. If we can muddy the water enough, regulators will have trouble establishing clear causation. The phrase "muddy the water" in the context of a water contamination case felt like deliberate mockery of the families whose children were dying from chemicals Richardson had knowingly dumped into their drinking supply. Another email chain revealed discussions about timing their most toxic dumps to coincide with heavy rainfall periods, when dilution would make detection less likely during routine water quality testing. They'd literally scheduled their poisoning of public water supplies around weather patterns to maximize their chances of avoiding regulatory oversight. The corporate callousness was breathtaking in its scope and sophistication. Richardson had established a legal strategy that involved overwhelming affected communities with procedural challenges, while simultaneously funding pseudoscientific studies designed to create doubt about the health impacts of chemical contamination. They'd hired teams of expert witnesses whose job was to testify that cancer clusters were coincidental, that birth defects had other causes, that the statistical evidence was inconclusive. This was where Pemberton Hayes and Associates had entered the picture. Richardson needed a law firm with the resources and reputation to execute a defense strategy that could withstand federal scrutiny while protecting corporate interests worth hundreds of millions of dollars. They needed attorneys skilled enough to challenge environmental science while maintaining plausible deniability about the human costs of chemical dumping. According to the court filings, Veronica had been assigned to the Richardson case 8 months ago as the lead associate responsible for developing their environmental compliance defense. Her role involved reviewing all internal company communications, coordinating with expert witnesses, and crafting legal arguments that would either dismiss the case entirely or minimize Richardson's financial liability. Reading through her preliminary briefs and legal memoranda, I could see Veronica's fingerprints all over Richardson's defense strategy. She'd developed arguments claiming that the Environmental Protection Coalition lacked standing to sue because they couldn't prove direct individual harm from the contamination. She'd filed motions to exclude medical evidence on technical grounds, arguing that correlation didn't establish causation even when children were dying from rare cancers at unprecedented rates. Most disturbing was a legal strategy memo she'd written, recommending that Richardson challenge the federal government's authority to regulate chemical dumping in waterways that cross state boundaries. Her argument was that environmental protection was primarily a state responsibility, and that federal intervention violated principles of local governance. It was a sophisticated constitutional argument, designed to create legal uncertainty that could delay environmental remediation for years, while children continued drinking contaminated water. But the personal betrayal went deeper than professional strategy. Cross-referencing the corporate filings, I discovered that Bradley Morrison, Veronica's husband, held significant investments in several companies that did business with Richardson Industries. His investment portfolio included substantial holdings in chemical transportation firms, waste management companies, and environmental consulting businesses that profited from the very contamination that was poisoning children. The luxury condominiums Veronica and Bradley were planning to purchase in the exclusive Willowbrook Heights development were being built on land that Richardson Industries had donated to the city after promising it was environmentally clean. Internal company documents revealed that the land had been used for chemical storage for decades and required millions of dollars in remediation before it would be safe for residential development. Veronica wasn't just defending a corporation that was poisoning children. She was protecting financial interests that directly benefited her family while living on property that her client had contaminated and then dumped on unsuspecting homeowners. The moral corruption was so complete it felt almost artistic in its symmetry. As I studied the medical reports attached to the case file, I found myself looking at photographs of the actual children whose lives had been destroyed by Richardson's dumping operations. 8-year-old Timothy Walsh, who developed brain cancer and lost the ability to speak after tumor surgery. 6-year-old Maria Santos, whose leukemia treatments had left her bald and skeletal but who still smiled bravely in hospital photos. 12-year-old David Chen, who'd been born with severe birth defects that doctors directly attributed to chemical exposure during his mother's pregnancy. These weren't abstract legal concepts or statistical anomalies. They were real children with names and faces and families who loved them. They were kids who would never play sports, never go to college, never have children of their own, because a corporation had decided their lives were worth less than quarterly profit margins. And my sister was working 16-hour days to make sure the people responsible for their suffering faced no consequences. Tomorrow morning, Veronica would walk into federal court believing she was about to demonstrate her legal brilliance to some random judge who might be impressed by her sophisticated arguments and meticulous preparation. She had no idea that the judge reviewing her carefully crafted defense of child poisoning would be the sister whose emotional pleas for support she'd dismissed as professional weakness. The universe, it seemed, had been orchestrating this confrontation for months. Every time I'd reached out to Veronica for understanding about the weight of environmental cases, she'd been too busy building the very defense strategies I would now evaluate. Every conversation where she'd minimized my concerns about corporate crime, she'd been actively participating in covering up systematic poisoning of children. Monday morning would reveal whether Veronica's legal arguments could withstand scrutiny from someone who understood both the law and the human cost of environmental crimes. Someone who'd spent sleepless nights studying the medical evidence she was trying to dismiss. Someone who knew exactly how corporate attorneys manipulated legal technicalities to avoid accountability for poisoning communities. Justice was about to become very personal indeed. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn clarity that made everything feel sharp and inevitable. I woke at 5:15 a.m., earlier than usual, with the hyper-aware alertness that comes before life-changing events. My standard pre-court routine took on additional significance today. Every detail mattered because this wouldn't just be another day on the federal bench. This would be the day Veronica learned who her sister really was. I selected my most authoritative black robe from the judicial closet, the one I'd worn during the landmark Patterson civil rights case that had established new precedents for federal oversight of municipal police departments. I chose the pearl earrings Chief Justice Hamilton had given me at my swearing-in ceremony, and pulled my hair back in the severe chignon that court artists had described as commanding in their newspaper sketches. Every element of my appearance needed to communicate absolute judicial authority. The drive to the Edmund Fitzgerald Federal Courthouse took me through downtown Riverside Heights as the city was waking up. Coffee shops opening their doors, early commuters hurrying toward office buildings, joggers taking advantage of the cool morning air. It was a normal Monday for everyone, except the people whose lives would be forever changed by what happened in courtroom 3A today. I arrived at the courthouse an hour before the scheduled hearing, using my private judicial entrance to avoid the media circus that had already begun gathering on the front steps. The Richardson Industries case had attracted significant attention from environmental advocacy groups, medical organizations, and local news outlets. Protesters with signs reading "Children's Lives Matter" and "Stop Corporate Poisoning" were setting up in the designated demonstration area across the street, their voices carrying across the plaza as they chanted demands for justice. My chambers felt particularly quiet that morning, insulated from the growing crowd outside by thick stone walls and soundproof windows designed to protect judicial deliberation from external pressure. I used the extra time to review every detail of the case one final time, ensuring that my decisions would be based purely on legal merit and constitutional principles, not personal satisfaction or family dynamics. The case materials painted an even more disturbing picture when read in their entirety. The Environmental Protection Coalition had assembled evidence showing that Richardson Industries hadn't just violated environmental regulations, they'd systematically corrupted the regulatory process itself. Internal company documents revealed a network of relationships with state environmental officials who'd been receiving, quote, consulting fees from Richardson while supposedly overseeing their compliance with dumping regulations. One particularly damning email chain showed Richardson executives discussing how to time their most toxic chemical releases to coincide with periods when their paid consultants were conducting water quality inspections. They'd literally choreographed their contamination activities around the schedules of regulators they'd corrupted, ensuring that official testing would miss the worst pollution events. The medical evidence was even more compelling when reviewed systematically. Dr. Hennings had produced epidemiological studies showing not just correlation but clear causation between Richardson's dumping activities and the explosion of childhood cancers in affected communities. She'd tracked contamination plumes through groundwater systems, demonstrating how chemicals dumped at Richardson facilities were appearing in residential water supplies weeks later, at concentrations that exceeded safe exposure limits by factors of 10 or more. Most devastating were the company's own internal safety assessments, conducted by environmental consultants Richardson had hired to evaluate the health risks of their dumping operations. These reports, marked confidential and attorney-client privileged, explicitly warned that continued chemical releases would cause significant increases in cancer rates among exposed populations, particularly children and pregnant women. Richardson's executives had received clear warnings that their activities would cause children to develop cancer, and they'd decided to continue dumping anyway. They hadn't just ignored environmental regulations. They'd made calculated business decisions to trade children's lives for operational cost savings. At 8:30 a.m., my clerk Jennifer Martinez knocked on my chamber's door. "Your Honor, both legal teams have arrived. The plaintiff's counsel is ready, and the Richardson defense team from Pemberton Hayes is in Conference Room B doing final preparations." Conference Room B, where Veronica was probably reviewing her notes one last time, confident that she was about to walk into a routine preliminary hearing with some anonymous federal judge who might be impressed by her firm's prestigious reputation and sophisticated legal arguments. She had no idea that her biggest professional performance would be playing out before the one person who knew exactly how much her success meant to her, and exactly how morally bankrupt her legal strategies really were. "Thank you, Jennifer. Please inform both sides that we'll begin promptly at 9 a.m. I want all preliminary motions addressed before we move to substantive arguments." At 8:55 a.m., I made my way through the corridors connecting my chambers to Courtroom 3A. The hallways buzzed with activity, attorneys conferring with clients, reporters setting up equipment, environmental advocates filling the public gallery. I could hear the low murmur of conversation from inside the courtroom, lawyers making final preparations for what they knew would be a landmark environmental case. I paused outside the courtroom doors, taking one final moment to center myself and ensure that my emotional state was properly calibrated for judicial responsibility. Through the frosted glass panels, I could see the familiar silhouettes of a federal courtroom in session. The elevated judge's bench, the attorney tables, the gallery filled with observers waiting to witness how American justice would handle corporate environmental crimes. In less than 5 minutes, Veronica would discover that her government worker sister controlled this entire space with absolute authority. The woman who'd called me hired help would be forced to address me as Your Honor, while defending systematic child poisoning before the bench I'd earned through 16 years of legal excellence. Bailiff Officer Marcus Thompson appeared at my side, his presence formal and commanding. "Ready, Your Honor?" "Ready." His voice boomed through the courtroom with the traditional authority that opened every federal proceeding. "All rise! The United States District Court for the Northern District of Illinois is now in session, the Honorable Judge Natasha Clearwater presiding." The massive oak doors opened, and I walked into my courtroom with measured steps, my robe flowing behind me like a declaration of judicial power. The room fell into absolute silence except for the rustle of 40 people rising to their feet in unison, showing the respect that federal law demanded for the position I held. I kept my eyes focused straight ahead as I approached the bench, but my peripheral vision caught the exact moment Veronica realized who was wearing the black robe. Her sharp intake of breath was audible, even from across the courtroom. I saw her hand fly to her chest, her mouth opening in shock before she caught herself and tried to rearrange her expression into something more professionally appropriate. But the damage was already done. For those crucial few seconds, Veronica's carefully constructed courtroom persona had completely shattered, replaced by the stunned recognition that her sister, the sister she'd humiliated just 72 hours earlier, now held absolute power over the most important case of her career. I took my seat behind the bench, the elevated position giving me a commanding view of both attorney tables and the packed gallery. To my left sat the Environmental Protection Coalition's legal team, 3 dedicated public interest attorneys who looked exhausted but determined, surrounded by their clients, parents of poisoned children, medical professionals who'd documented the health crisis, environmental scientists who'd traced the contamination to its source. To my right sat the Richardson Industries defense team from Pemberton Hayes and Associates. Veronica had recovered her composure somewhat, but I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her manicured fingers gripped her legal pad just slightly too tightly. She was flanked by 2 senior partners and a junior associate, all of them probably wondering why their lead attorney looked like she'd seen a ghost. Behind the defense table, I spotted Bradley Morrison in the second row, having come to watch his wife's career-defining moment. His presence added an extra layer of poetic justice to what was about to unfold. The man whose investment portfolio benefited from environmental crimes was about to watch his wife's legal arguments evaluated by the sister-in-law he'd never bothered to respect. "Please be seated," I said, my voice carrying the natural authority that 18 months on the federal bench had developed. "We are here today for preliminary hearings in the matter of Environmental Protection Coalition versus Richardson Industries. Will counsel please state their names and representations for the record?" The moment of reckoning had finally arrived. The lead attorney for the Environmental Protection Coalition spoke first, his voice steady and professional. "Dr. Michael Harrison, representing the Plaintiff Environmental Protection Coalition, Your Honor." Then it was Veronica's turn. I watched her rise slowly from the defense table, her designer suit impeccable, her voice carefully modulated to project confidence she clearly didn't feel. "Veronica Clearwater Morrison, representing defendant Richardson Industries, on behalf of Pemberton Hayes and Associates, Your Honor." The irony of that moment was exquisite. Veronica had to address me by the judicial title she'd spent years dismissing, had to show me the respect she'd never demonstrated in private, had to acknowledge my authority in front of an audience that included her husband, her colleagues, and the families whose children her client had poisoned. The power dynamic between us had just reversed completely and permanently. "Thank you, counsel. Before we proceed with preliminary arguments, I want to establish the ground rules for these proceedings." I looked directly at Veronica as I spoke, watching her struggle to maintain professional composure while processing the surreal situation. This court operates under strict standards of evidence and constitutional law. We will not tolerate grandstanding, inflammatory rhetoric, or attempts to obfuscate legal issues through procedural manipulation. We are here to determine questions of law and fact based on evidence, precedent, and the principles of environmental justice. Nothing more, nothing less. Veronica nodded stiffly, but I could see the wheels turning behind her eyes. She was probably calculating whether she should request a recusal due to our family relationship, whether there was some procedural maneuver that could extract her from this nightmare scenario. But she would find no escape clause for familial embarrassment. As long as I could demonstrate impartiality, which I absolutely could, there were no grounds for recusal. Veronica would have to argue her defense of child poisoning before the sister she'd humiliated, while maintaining the professional courtesy that federal court protocol demanded. Dr. Harrison, please proceed with your opening statement regarding the preliminary injunction motion. The Environmental Protection Coalition's case was devastating from the first sentence. Dr. Harrison methodically outlined Richardson Industries' systematic contamination of the Clearwater River system, presenting evidence that was so overwhelming and well-documented that even skilled corporate attorneys would struggle to create reasonable doubt about causation and intent. Your Honor, the evidence will show that Richardson Industries has engaged in a deliberate, systematic campaign to poison the drinking water of over 2 million American citizens, Dr. Harrison began, his voice carrying the moral weight of absolute conviction. This is not a case of accidental contamination or regulatory oversight. This is a case of corporate executives making calculated decisions to trade children's lives for quarterly profits. He presented a timeline showing that Richardson's illegal dumping had increased dramatically over the past 3 years, coinciding exactly with the explosion of childhood cancer rates in affected communities. He displayed charts demonstrating that contamination levels were highest during periods when Richardson was under financial pressure to reduce operational costs, suggesting that environmental crimes were being used as a profit enhancement strategy. Most damaging was his presentation of Richardson's own internal documents, including the emails I'd reviewed showing executives joking about keeping tree huggers in the dark while discussing strategies to conceal contamination from federal regulators. When Dr. Harrison read those communications aloud, several people in the gallery gasped audibly, and I noticed Veronica's face growing progressively paler. The defendant's own communications reveal not just knowledge of the contamination, but active celebration of their success in avoiding accountability for environmental crimes, Dr. Harrison continued. These are not the communications of a company making good faith efforts to comply with environmental law. These are the communications of corporate criminals who view public health as an acceptable casualty of business operations. When Dr. Harrison finished his presentation, the courtroom was filled with the kind of heavy silence that follows devastating testimony. The evidence he'd presented wasn't just legally compelling, it was morally overwhelming. Any reasonable person listening to those facts would conclude that Richardson Industries had engaged in systematic environmental crimes that required immediate federal intervention. Then it was Veronica's turn to respond, and I watched my sister stand to defend the indefensible before the bench I'd earned through 16 years of legal excellence. Your Honor, she began, her voice professionally modulated but lacking her usual courtroom confidence. The plaintiff's presentation, while emotionally compelling, fails to meet the legal standards required for preliminary injunctive relief. Correlation is not causation, and anecdotal evidence is not scientific proof. It was a technically competent opening, but I could hear the strain in her voice. Veronica was trying to execute her prepared legal strategy while simultaneously processing the psychological shock of arguing before her own sister. Her usual courtroom swagger had been replaced by visible uncertainty about how to navigate this unprecedented situation. The plaintiff asks this court to shut down a major manufacturing facility based on statistical associations that could have multiple explanations, she continued. warming to her argument despite the circumstances. Environmental factors are complex, Your Honor. Cancer rates can be influenced by air pollution, genetic predisposition, lifestyle factors, and numerous other variables that the plaintiff has failed to eliminate as potential causes. As she spoke, I found myself analyzing not just her legal arguments, but the moral framework underlying her defense strategy. Veronica was essentially arguing that poisoned children were acceptable collateral damage as long as corporate responsibility couldn't be proven beyond all possible doubt. She was asking me to prioritize legal technicalities over the lives of kids who were dying from rare cancers at unprecedented rates. Furthermore, Your Honor, Richardson Industries has consistently demonstrated good faith efforts to comply with environmental regulations, Veronica continued, apparently without irony given the evidence of systematic corruption that had just been presented. Any alleged violations represent technical disagreements about regulatory interpretation, not deliberate environmental crimes. The courtroom stirred at this claim. Parents of poisoned children shook their heads in disbelief. Environmental scientists looked genuinely shocked that anyone would characterize systematic chemical dumping as technical disagreements. Even the court reporter glanced up from her machine, apparently unable to maintain professional neutrality in the face of such obvious misrepresentation. But Veronica pressed forward with her defense, apparently believing that legal sophistication could overcome moral bankruptcy. The plaintiff's motion for preliminary injunction would cause irreparable harm to Richardson Industries without corresponding environmental benefits, she argued. Shutting down manufacturing operations would eliminate hundreds of jobs and disrupt supply chains across multiple industries, while the alleged environmental benefits remain speculative and unproven. I listened to my sister argue that corporate profits and job preservation justified continued poisoning of children's drinking water. I watched her present legal theories designed to prioritize business operations over public health. I observed her attempt to convince a federal judge that systematic environmental crimes were acceptable as long as they supported economic activity. The woman who'd called me hired help was now asking me to rule that Richardson Industries could continue poisoning children because stopping them would be economically inconvenient. The sister who'd dismissed my concerns about environmental cases was now defending the very corporate criminality that had kept me awake nights. When Veronica finished her opening argument, I maintained the same neutral judicial expression I used for every attorney who appeared before my bench. But internally, I was processing the profound moral disconnect between the woman who'd raised me to believe in protecting the vulnerable and the attorney who was now asking me to prioritize corporate interests over children's lives. Thank you, Ms. Morrison. The court will now hear evidence regarding the plaintiff's motion for preliminary injunctive relief. Dr. Harrison, please call your first witness. What followed would be a systematic destruction of every argument Veronica had spent 8 months crafting, presented by witnesses whose testimony would expose not just Richardson's environmental crimes, but the moral bankruptcy of the legal strategies designed to protect them. The real education was just beginning. The first witness called by the Environmental Protection Coalition was Dr. Patricia Hennings, the county's chief epidemiologist, whose statistical analysis had established the undeniable link between Richardson's dumping operations and the explosion of childhood cancers in affected communities. As she made her way to the witness stand, carrying a thick folder of medical records and research data, I could see Veronica's jaw tighten visibly. This wasn't going to be the clean corporate battle she'd prepared for. This was going to be a very human, very personal accounting of environmental crimes. Dr. Harrison guided Dr. Hennings through her testimony with surgical precision, establishing her credentials as one of the nation's leading experts in environmental health, before moving to the devastating evidence she'd compiled over the past 18 months. Dr. Harrison began, "Can you describe for the court the methodology you used to establish causation between Richardson Industries' chemical releases and the health crisis in affected communities?" "Yes, Your Honor. We conducted what's called a retrospective cohort study, tracking health outcomes in populations exposed to varying levels of contamination from Richardson's dumping sites. We compared cancer rates, birth defect rates, and other health indicators between heavily exposed communities and control populations with no exposure to Richardson's chemicals. Dr. Hennings opened her folder and produced a series of charts that she projected onto the courtroom's display screens. The visual evidence was staggering. Clear graphs showing that childhood cancer rates increased in direct proportion to proximity to Richardson's contamination sources, with children living closest to dumping sites developing leukemia at rates nearly 6 times the national average. The statistical correlation is so strong that it approaches mathematical certainty, Dr. Hennings continued, her voice carrying the weight of scientific authority. In epidemiology, we look for relative risk ratios above 2.0 to suggest possible causation. The communities most heavily exposed to Richardson's chemicals show relative risk ratios above 5.8 for childhood leukemia and 4.2 for rare brain cancers. I watched Veronica frantically taking notes, probably trying to identify technical challenges to Dr. Hennings' methodology. But the epidemiologist had anticipated every possible attack on her research, presenting data that was so comprehensive and rigorous that even sophisticated corporate attorneys would struggle to undermine its credibility. Dr. Hennings, did you consider alternative explanations for the health patterns you observed? Dr. Harrison asked. Absolutely. We controlled for air pollution, socioeconomic factors, genetic predisposition, lifestyle variables, and every other potential confounding factor we could identify. The only variable that consistently predicted health outcomes was proximity to Richardson's chemical contamination. Children drinking water with higher concentrations of Richardson's chemicals were developing cancer at rates that cannot be explained by any factor other than toxic exposure. The testimony continued for 45 minutes, with Dr. Hennings presenting case after case of children whose cancers could be directly traced to Richardson's dumping operations. She displayed medical records showing healthy toddlers who'd developed rare blood cancers within months of Richardson increasing their chemical releases in nearby waterways. She presented birth certificate data showing dramatic increases in neural tube defects among babies born to mothers who'd consumed contaminated water during pregnancy. When Dr. Harrison finished his direct examination, it was Veronica's turn to cross-examine the witness. I could see her internal struggle. She needed to challenge Dr. Hennings' testimony to protect her client. But any aggressive questioning of a respected epidemiologist presenting evidence about poisoned children would make her look heartless in front of a gallery filled with affected families. Veronica rose slowly, her usual courtroom confidence noticeably absent. Dr. Hennings, isn't it true that correlation doesn't always establish causation, even when statistical associations appear strong? Dr. Hennings looked at Veronica with the patient expression of someone who'd faced this question countless times from corporate attorneys. Counselor, in epidemiology, we use what's called the Bradford-Hill criteria to establish causation from observational data. These criteria include strength of association, dose-response relationship, temporal sequence, biological plausibility, and consistency across multiple studies. The relationship between Richardson's contamination and childhood cancers meets every single criterion. Veronica's cross-examination was falling apart before it had properly begun. Every challenge she raised seemed to elicit more damaging information, and Dr. Hennings' scientific authority was proving difficult to undermine with legal technicalities. Dr. Hennings, couldn't other environmental factors explain the health patterns you've observed? Veronica tried again, her voice carrying a note of desperation. We tested for over 40 potential environmental confounders, including air pollution from traffic, naturally occurring chemicals in soil, electromagnetic radiation from power lines, and industrial emissions from other sources. None of these factors showed any correlation with the health patterns we observed. The only consistent predictor was exposure to Richardson's specific chemical cocktail. The next witness was even more devastating to Veronica's defense. Dr. Harrison called Maria Santos, the mother of 8-year-old Timothy, who'd developed brain cancer after drinking contaminated water for 2 years. As Mrs. Santos made her way slowly to the witness stand, her dignity evident despite the obvious toll of caring for a critically ill child, several people in the gallery began crying quietly. "Mrs. Santos," Dr. Harrison said gently, "can you tell the court about your son Timothy's health before and after Richardson Industries began dumping chemicals near your neighborhood?" Mrs. Santos's testimony was heartbreaking in its simplicity. She described a healthy, energetic boy who loved soccer and reading, who'd never had any health problems beyond normal childhood illnesses. She explained how their family had lived in the same house for 12 years, drinking well water that had always been clean and safe. "Everything changed 18 months ago," Mrs. Santos said, her voice steady but her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Timothy started getting headaches every day. Then he began having trouble at school, forgetting things, having difficulty reading. The doctors said his brain tumor was very aggressive, very unusual for a child his age." She pulled out a photograph of Timothy before his diagnosis, a smiling boy with bright eyes and a soccer ball under his arm. Then she showed a recent hospital photo of the same child, bald from chemotherapy, his face gaunt from treatments that were barely keeping him alive. "The oncologist told us that Timothy's type of brain cancer is almost never seen in children unless they've been exposed to specific industrial chemicals," Mrs. Santos continued. "When we tested our well water, we found exactly those chemicals at levels 60 times higher than what's considered safe." Veronica's cross-examination of Mrs. Santos lasted less than 10 minutes. Any aggressive questioning of a mother whose child was dying from cancer would have been professional suicide, and Veronica seemed to realize that her best strategy was to minimize the damage rather than challenge testimony that was obviously truthful and deeply sympathetic. But the most damaging moment came when Dr. Harrison called his surprise witness, Dr. James Mitchell, Richardson Industries' former head of environmental compliance, who'd been fired 6 months earlier for raising concerns about the company's dumping practices. Dr. Mitchell's testimony was the nuclear bomb that completely destroyed Veronica's case. Under oath, he systematically revealed Richardson's internal decision-making process, explaining how company executives had received explicit warnings about health risks and had chosen to continue dumping anyway. "Dr. Mitchell," Dr. Harrison asked, "did Richardson Industries executives know that their dumping operations would cause children to develop cancer?" "Yes, absolutely. I personally presented them with environmental impact assessments, showing that continued chemical releases would result in significant increases in childhood cancer rates. The CEO, Marcus Thornfield, told me that potential health impacts were, quote, externalities that the company wasn't responsible for addressing." The courtroom erupted in gasps and murmurs. Veronica looked like she might physically collapse, as her client's former environmental officer testified that Richardson had knowingly chosen to poison children rather than invest in proper waste disposal. "Did company executives discuss strategies for concealing health impacts from federal regulators?" Dr. Harrison continued. "They hired public relations firms specifically to cast doubt on any connections between our dumping and community health problems. They funded fake scientific studies designed to create confusion about causation. They even discussed timing our most toxic releases to coincide with periods when sympathetic state officials would be conducting water quality inspections." Dr. Mitchell produced internal emails showing Veronica herself coordinating with public relations consultants to develop messaging that would minimize Richardson's liability for childhood cancers. Her own electronic signature was attached to strategy documents outlining how to challenge medical evidence and discredit environmental scientists. When Dr. Harrison asked Dr. Mitchell to read one particular email aloud, Veronica looked like she wanted to disappear entirely. It was her own communication with Richardson executives, written 4 months earlier, discussing how to, quote, manage the narrative around pediatric health outcomes to protect the company's operational flexibility. The email was clinical in its callousness. To maintain regulatory compliance while preserving cost efficiencies, we recommend implementing the following communications protocols. Challenge all epidemiological studies on methodological grounds, emphasize uncertainty in causation analysis, and redirect focus toward economic impacts of environmental restrictions. Veronica had written a strategic memo for concealing the relationship between chemical dumping and childhood cancer, and now her own words were being read aloud in federal court as evidence of systematic environmental crimes. By the time Dr. Mitchell finished his testimony, Veronica's carefully constructed defense had been completely demolished. Her client's former environmental officer had provided first-hand testimony that Richardson Industries had knowingly poisoned children, and Veronica's own communications had been entered into evidence as proof of a conspiracy to conceal environmental crimes. I watched my sister sit at the defense table, her face pale and her hands visibly shaking, as the full scope of her professional and moral catastrophe became clear. The sister who'd called me hired help had just watched her biggest case crumble in front of her own family, her colleagues, and the families whose children she'd helped poison. But the cascading consequences were just beginning. When the testimony concluded, the courtroom fell into the kind of heavy silence that follows devastating revelations. The evidence presented wasn't just legally compelling, it was morally overwhelming. Richardson Industries had systematically poisoned children for 3 years, while their attorneys, led by my sister, had crafted strategies to conceal the environmental crimes and avoid accountability. I had heard enough. The preliminary injunction motion was no longer a complex legal question requiring extended deliberation. The evidence of systematic environmental crimes was so overwhelming that continued operation of Richardson's dumping facilities would constitute ongoing federal crimes under my judicial watch. Based on the evidence presented today, I announced, my voice carrying the full authority of the federal bench. This court grants the plaintiff's motion for preliminary injunctive relief. Richardson Industries is hereby ordered to immediately cease all chemical discharge operations pending full environmental remediation and criminal investigation. The courtroom erupted. Environmental advocates in the gallery began crying with relief. Parents of poisoned children embraced each other, finally seeing hope that their nightmare might end. Reporters rushed toward the exits to file breaking news stories about the federal ruling that would reshape environmental law enforcement across multiple states. But I wasn't finished. The evidence presented had revealed not just environmental crimes but systematic corruption that required immediate federal intervention. Furthermore, I continued, my voice cutting through the courtroom noise, the evidence of deliberate environmental crimes and regulatory corruption presented today compels this court to take additional action. I am immediately referring this matter to the United States Attorney's Office for criminal investigation of all Richardson Industries executives involved in the systematic contamination of public water supplies. Veronica's face went ashen. Criminal referral meant potential felony charges for her clients, and potentially for the attorneys who'd helped conceal environmental crimes. Her biggest professional triumph had just become a career-ending catastrophe. Additionally, the evidence of attorney involvement in concealing environmental crimes requires notification of the State Bar Association for immediate ethics investigation. The court has serious concerns about legal strategies that prioritize corporate profits over public health and child safety. That was the moment Veronica's career died. Ethics investigations for attorneys involved in concealing environmental crimes typically resulted in professional suspension or disbarment. No law firm would hire an attorney under investigation for helping conceal systematic child poisoning. As I outlined the terms of the injunction and the massive damages Richardson would face, preliminary estimates of $800 million for healthcare costs and environmental remediation, I could see phones buzzing throughout the gallery. Word was spreading faster than Veronica could process what had just happened to her life. The first consequence came before I'd even left the bench. I watched through the courtroom windows as Mr. Pemberton, the managing partner whose wife had lectured me about giving Veronica space for important work, approached the defense table with an expression of barely controlled fury. The conversation was brief, hushed, and devastating. By the time it ended, Veronica was no longer employed by Pemberton, Hayes, and Associates. Fired. Not laid off, not asked to resign, but terminated for cause effective immediately. 24 hours after calling me hired help, Veronica had become unemployed, her partnership prospects destroyed, her reputation in ruins, her professional future non-existent. But the professional consequences were just the beginning. As I gathered my files and prepared to return to Chambers, I could hear Bradley confronting his wife in voices that carried despite their attempts at discretion. $800 million, Veronica, $800 million in damages, plus criminal investigation. Do you understand what this means for our investments? For our reputation? For our daughter's future? His voice was rising despite his efforts to maintain privacy. Every business relationship I have is now toxic because my wife was caught helping poison children. The house, the cars, the country club membership, everything we've built is finished. The marriage that had seemed so perfect at the baby shower, the successful attorney and her investment banker husband building their empire together, was fracturing in real time. Bradley's carefully cultivated social circle would never accept association with someone linked to systematic child poisoning. His business relationships would evaporate once word spread about his wife's role in concealing environmental crimes. The baby, Veronica, Bradley continued, his voice breaking slightly. What kind of world are we bringing our daughter into when her mother is facing potential criminal charges for helping poison other people's children? The question hung in the air like a physical blow. Veronica had spent months posting on social media about building a better world for the next generation, while actively working to harm the most vulnerable children in her community. The hypocrisy was so profound that even her own husband could see it clearly. Within hours, the consequences began cascading across every aspect of Veronica's life with brutal efficiency. My clerk Jennifer brought me updates as the legal community processed the implications of the Richardson ruling. Your Honor, I thought you should know that the State Bar Association has already opened a formal investigation based on the evidence presented today. And the American Bar Association has issued a statement calling for a comprehensive review of attorney ethics in environmental cases. The legal community was moving quickly to distance itself from the systematic corruption that had been exposed in my courtroom. Veronica's recorded communications had made her radioactive. No firm would hire her, no clients would trust her, no colleagues would associate with her. By evening, the story had exploded across national media. The federal ruling that shut down a major corporation for systematic child poisoning was front-page news. But the personal drama of a federal judge presiding over her sister's professional destruction was the human interest angle that captured public attention. Federal judge rules against sister's environmental law firm in landmark child poisoning case, read the headline in the Washington Post. The accompanying article included photographs from Veronica's social media accounts, images of her baby shower, her posts about meaningful legal work, her quotes about building a better world for the next generation, contrasted with audio transcripts of her voice discussing strategies to conceal environmental crimes. The irony was devastating and perfectly documented. Social media posts about protecting families were published alongside legal briefs, arguing that poisoned children were acceptable business costs. Instagram photos of her baby shower were printed next to federal court transcripts, where she defended systematic contamination of children's drinking water. Veronica's professional network collapsed overnight. LinkedIn connections began disappearing as colleagues distanced themselves from the scandal. Speaking engagements were canceled. Professional organizations quietly removed her from committees and advisory boards. The carefully curated image of the successful environmental attorney who fought for meaningful causes had been completely destroyed by evidence of her real work protecting corporate criminals. But perhaps the most devastating consequence came from our own family. By Tuesday evening, our parents had learned about the federal ruling through news coverage that identified both Veronica and me by name. The story was impossible to ignore. Judge presides over sister's professional destruction in environmental crimes case. Mom called first, her voice strained with confusion and horror. Natasha, we saw the news coverage. Is it true what they're saying about Veronica's case? About children being poisoned? Mom, the court proceedings are part of the public record now. The evidence speaks for itself. There was a long silence before she spoke again, and when she did, her voice carried a tone I'd never heard before. Disappointment so profound it felt like grief. The recordings they played on the news, Veronica's voice discussing strategies to hide health problems from children. We never raised her to think that way. How did she become someone who would help hurt children for money? It was the first time I'd ever heard our mother question Veronica's choices directly. For 25 years, Mom had made excuses for Veronica's behavior, rationalized her selfishness, enabled her manipulation of family dynamics. But there was no way to rationalize audio recordings of Veronica planning to conceal evidence that companies were poisoning children. Dad's reaction was even more crushing for Veronica. When reporters contacted him for comment about his daughter's courtroom confrontation, his statement was brief and devastating. I'm proud of Judge Clearwater's commitment to protecting children and enforcing environmental law. As for Veronica's actions, they speak for themselves. No defense, no family loyalty, overriding moral judgment. Dad had publicly chosen sides, and Veronica had lost. The golden child who'd spent 25 years as the family favorite had become the daughter whose choices our parents couldn't defend or explain. The social consequences extended far beyond professional and family relationships. The country club where Veronica had held her baby shower issued a statement distancing themselves from members whose actions conflicted with community values. Her exclusive prenatal yoga class, her luxury gym, her high-end mothers group, all the social spaces where she'd built her identity as a successful professional woman, became uncomfortable territories where whispers followed her everywhere. Within a week, Veronica had gone from being Riverside Heights' rising legal star to a social pariah whose own family questioned her moral character. The sister who'd called me hired help was now facing potential criminal charges, professional ostracism, social exile, and the collapse of her marriage. But the transformation went beyond personal consequences. The Richardson ruling had triggered a nationwide review of environmental law enforcement that would reshape how federal courts handled corporate crimes against public health. Law schools were already incorporating my decision into their environmental law curricula. Environmental protection agencies in 12 states had announced enhanced enforcement protocols based on the precedents I'd established. The quiet sister, who'd been dismissed as irrelevant, had issued a federal ruling that would protect vulnerable communities for generations to come. Justice, it seemed, had found its perfect expression. 2 years later, I stood in the same crystal ballroom at Goldstone Manor, but this time the gathering was in my honor. The American Bar Association was presenting me with the Federal Judicial Excellence Award for my groundbreaking work in environmental law and civil rights, and the transformation in how people treated me was nothing short of remarkable. Where Veronica's social circle had once looked through me or offered patronizing smiles, I now commanded genuine respect and admiration from legal professionals across the nation. The irony of the location wasn't lost on anyone present, including the legal journalists who'd specifically noted it in their coverage. The same ballroom where I'd been called hired help was now hosting a ceremony celebrating my elevation to the Federal Appellate Court, a lifetime appointment that represented the pinnacle of judicial achievement in American law. The past 24 months had brought recognition beyond anything I could have imagined when I was quietly moving chairs at Veronica's baby shower. The Richardson Industries ruling had indeed become a landmark case, cited in environmental law decisions across 43 states, and referenced in congressional testimony about corporate accountability. My opinion had been excerpted in constitutional law textbooks and was now required reading in federal judicial training programs. During the cocktail reception before the award ceremony, I was approached by Justice Elizabeth Warren III, who served on the Supreme Court Environmental Law Committee. "Judge Clearwater," she said with genuine warmth, "I wanted to personally thank you for your courageous handling of the Richardson case. The precedent you established has already prevented dozens of similar environmental crimes across the country. You've literally saved lives with your judicial leadership." The same legal community that had once dismissed me as Veronica's less successful sister now recognized me as one of the most influential federal judges of my generation. Environmental law scholars wrote articles analyzing my judicial philosophy. Federal judicial conferences invited me as a keynote speaker. The president had recently nominated me for elevation to the U.S. Court of Appeals, with confirmation hearings scheduled for next month. But the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. During the award presentation, Dr. Patricia Hennings took the podium to introduce me. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to meet the federal judge who listened when children needed protection." Judge Clearwater didn't just interpret environmental law, she enforced it with the courage and moral clarity that federal judicial power demands. Behind her on the projection screen were photographs of the children whose lives had been saved by the Richardson ruling. Timothy Santos, now cancer-free and back on his soccer team. Maria Rodriguez, whose birth defects had been successfully treated because early intervention became possible once Richardson's dumping stopped. David Chen, who would grow up healthy because federal enforcement had protected his community's water supply before permanent damage could occur. These children are alive and healthy today because Judge Clearwater understood that environmental law exists to protect real people, not corporate balance sheets, Dr. Hennings continued. She showed us what judicial courage looks like when vulnerable communities need federal protection. The applause was sustained and heartfelt, recognition not just for legal expertise, but for moral leadership that had tangible impact on human lives. This wasn't the polite recognition Veronica used to receive for her social media accomplishments. This was acknowledgement of work that had fundamentally changed how federal courts approached environmental crimes. After the ceremony, I was approached by Mrs. Santos, Timothy's mother, who'd driven 6 hours to attend the award presentation. "Judge Clearwater, I wanted you to see this," she said, pulling out her phone to show me a video of Timothy scoring a goal at his middle school soccer game. "The doctors say his brain scans are completely normal now. They say he has no lasting effects from the cancer because treatment started early enough." That conversation meant more to me than any professional accolade ever could. Real children living healthy lives because federal law had protected them. Real families staying together because environmental crimes had been stopped before irreversible damage occurred. Real communities with clean water because corporate criminals had been held accountable. The Richardson case had indeed reshaped environmental law enforcement nationwide. Congress had passed the Environmental Crimes Accountability Act, which mandated federal prosecution for systematic contamination of public water supplies. The EPA had established new rapid response protocols for investigating chemical dumping. 23 states had strengthened their environmental protection laws based on precedents established in my courtroom. My career had reached heights I'd never imagined possible during those early years of cleaning office buildings to pay for law school. The Federal Judicial Conference had elected me to chair their Environmental Law Committee. Harvard Law School had offered me a visiting professorship. Legal publications regularly sought my commentary on constitutional issues affecting environmental protection. But the most satisfying transformation was personal. I'd finally stopped seeking family validation for my accomplishments. The daughter who'd spent 25 years hoping Veronica would acknowledge my worth had evolved into a woman who found meaning in the work itself. In the lives protected, the precedents established, the vulnerable communities given voice through federal judicial power. Veronica's story had taken a dramatically different trajectory. The criminal investigation had resulted in plea agreements rather than felony convictions, but she'd been permanently disbarred from practicing law in any jurisdiction. Her testimony had helped federal prosecutors build cases against environmental criminals in 7 other states, earning her immunity from prosecution but destroying any chance of rebuilding her legal career. Her marriage to Bradley had ended in a divorce so acrimonious that it generated its own local news coverage. The financial settlements had consumed most of their assets, and Bradley had relocated to Seattle to restart his investment career away from the environmental crime scandal that had made him professionally toxic in Riverside Heights. Their daughter, now 18 months old, was being raised primarily by Bradley's family while Veronica struggled to rebuild her life from nothing. She'd found work as a paralegal at a small firm in another state, using her maiden name and hoping her past wouldn't follow her into whatever future she could construct from the wreckage of her choices. Our parents had undergone their own transformation during the past 2 years. Mom had become a volunteer advocate for environmental protection, serving on the board of the Clearwater River Conservation Coalition, as if trying to balance some cosmic equation by helping the communities Veronica had harmed. She told me privately that volunteering had helped her process the guilt of having enabled Veronica's behavior for so many years. I keep thinking about how we celebrated her successes without ever asking what kind of work she was really doing, Mom had confided during one of our monthly dinners. We were so proud of her big law firm job and her expensive lifestyle that we never wondered who was paying the real cost of her success. Dad had been more direct in his reckoning. I spent 25 years making excuses for Veronica's selfishness because she was charming and successful, he'd told me after my appellate court nomination was announced. I should have been paying attention to the daughter who was actually building something meaningful with her life. I'm sorry it took federal headlines for me to see what was right in front of me. It wasn't exactly an apology, but it was acknowledgement, recognition that quiet integrity had always been more valuable than flashy performance, that substance mattered more than style, that protecting vulnerable people was a higher calling than accumulating wealth and status. The most unexpected consequence of the entire ordeal had been my relationship with Chief Justice Hamilton, who'd become not just a mentor but a close friend as my reputation in constitutional law grew. Natasha, he'd told me during our last meeting, you've demonstrated something rare in federal judicial service, the ability to combine legal excellence with moral courage. The appellate court needs judges who understand that constitutional law serves justice, not political convenience. My confirmation hearings for the appellate appointment were scheduled to begin in 6 weeks. If confirmed, I would become the youngest federal appellate judge in the circuit's history, with jurisdiction over environmental and civil rights cases affecting millions of Americans across 8 states. Standing in my chambers that evening after the award ceremony, looking out at the federal courthouse plaza where protesters had once demanded justice for poisoned children, I reflected on how completely my life had transformed since that humiliating afternoon at Goldstone Manor. The helpful sister who'd been dismissed as irrelevant had become a nationally recognized voice for environmental protection and constitutional rights. Veronica had spent years trying to diminish my achievements while elevating her own image, never understanding that real power comes from competence, integrity, and the courage to use authority for protecting those who can't protect themselves. She'd built her identity on social positioning and superficial success, while I'd been quietly accumulating the kind of influence that shapes law and protects communities for generations. The baby shower humiliation that had triggered this entire journey now seemed like ancient history, a necessary catalyst that had revealed the fundamental difference between us. Veronica had chosen to use her legal education to help corporations avoid accountability for harming children. I had chosen to use mine to ensure that vulnerable communities received federal protection from environmental crimes. As I prepared to leave the courthouse where I'd served justice for the past 2 years, I thought about the children whose pictures Dr. Hennings had shown during the award ceremony, kids who would grow up healthy because federal law had protected their drinking water, families who stayed together because environmental criminals faced real consequences. Communities that could trust their government to prioritize public health over corporate profits. Justice, I'd learned, doesn't always arrive when you expect it. But when it does arrive, it brings with it a satisfaction deeper than any personal victory could provide. The scales had finally balanced, not through revenge or family drama, but through the principled application of federal law to protect the most vulnerable members of our society. The sister who'd called me hired help had taught me that true power isn't found in humiliating others or building social status. It's found in service to something larger than yourself, in using whatever influence you have to make the world safer for those who need protection most. And sometimes, just sometimes, the universe provides perfect opportunities to demonstrate that principle in action. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.